In my distant past, quite a few years ago now, I was involved in managing projects for designing, building and delivering Earth observation instruments, i.e. the payloads for satellites. Through that work I became involved in the Industry Trade Association, the Space Industry Trade Association, and then somehow became its chairman. So we're about 2004 at this point. And during that time, I and others became aware that within government, the perception of space, articulated by the Treasury and some others, was that space was rockets and toys for the boys, and that the government's subscription to ESA and the UK's activity in space, although well understood in terms of its ability to attract youngsters into science and technology careers, no one was really sure what the return to the economy was, or what the actual return on investment of the public funds was. So we set out as the industry to try to demonstrate through analysis what the economic impact of the UK's involvement in space was, and that gave rise to a report called Case for Space. Now, in doing that, we successfully managed to persuade the Treasury that there was value to the economy in the UK's increasing involvement in space, i.e. they would get a return on investment. And out of that came the Innovation and Growth Strategy. And the Innovation and Growth Strategy is a joint activity between industry and the government and public sector organisations to align various strategies on their parts to make the whole of the activity more focused. Now, as part of that process, the industry decided that there should be an ambition, to try and have a simple ambition. And I was there when it was formed, so I remember the finger going up in the air. And that ambition was to raise the UK's share of the global market for space and space-based services from what was then about 6 or 7% to 10% by 2030. And that gave a nice simple ambition which would demonstrate what the return on the investment from the public sector would be to the economy. Now that's important because a lot of space is funded by the Treasury, is funded by public sector activities, and the more the return is, the more we're likely to be able to persuade more money to be put into space. So this successfully persuaded the Treasury to increase the UK's investment in space. In fact, shortly after, at about the same time, I became involved in the EU's expert group advising the space activities in Framework 7. And I do remember a conversation where the EU officials came to me and said, "How did you persuade your Treasury to invest more in space? We need to do the same with the European Parliament. Just tell us how you did it." And I think over that 10-year period, it's interesting to see how things have changed. There was a public attitude that space was possibly a waste of money and it ought to go into hospitals and other public good activity. We see a lot less of that. We see more of space on television, more in the public awareness of space, culminating, I think, with Tim Peake's mission, which has generated a huge amount of public interest. So we have an ambition, 10% of the global market by 2030. And trying to align both public sector and industry agendas to achieve that. Now, I'm still involved in that role, although I retired a few years ago from my full-time day job and started doing a whole variety of other things which have been immensely rewarding. Involvement in space is still one of those things that I do, and I am involved in the Innovation and Growth Strategy and its delivery, in particular leading the activities which have led to where we are today in terms of the development of climate services as a commercial opportunity on the back of satellite data. And Surrey Satellite Technology support me in this activity. So I'm afraid this area of policy and so forth doesn't lend itself to whizzy videos or movies, but I will try to make this as entertaining as possible. I think the first thing to say is the policy landscape, as you may well be aware, is somewhat uncertain as we stand here today. A lot of this activity with climate is connected with Europe and the European Union, and our future relationships still have to be worked out. Personally, I hope we can stay involved with Copernicus and the other activities, because the EU is actually a significant driver in developing climate services. So I'll talk about the policy landscape, the space innovation and growth strategy, what the UK's priorities are, and some of the achievements to date. So the IGS, just note at the bottom, the IGS itself is a strategy, and it's delivered by what's being called the Space Growth Partnership. And the Space Growth Partnership is the combination of industry, government and academia to deliver the strategy. And the partnership includes UK Space, which is the trade association for the industry, the UK Space Agency, the Catapult, which has already been referred to, the KTN company, National Centre for Earth Observation, NERC, and some others. So the original Space IGS report set the targets, which I've already alluded to, capture 10% of an expected 400 billion world space economy for the UK by 2030, and in the process to create 100,000 new jobs. The report identified that the major growth opportunities are downstream in the applications of the capabilities of the satellite network. That means taking observation data or communication services and building commercial services that people are going to be prepared to pay for on the back of that data and communication capabilities. So the growth is in applications, not so much in putting more satellites up there. We will need more satellites, as we'll come to realise later on, but the growth opportunities and the return on investment comes from applying what those satellites can do. And that includes the development of climate information services based on the use of satellite observations. The Met Office would tell you this is a bit like weather forecasting, only for climate, and I think Chris summarised that sort of very succinctly in terms of climate is telling you what you might expect as weather at some point in the future. So it's like weather services, and if you think about where we were 10, 20 years ago with weather forecasting and weather services, it was very crude by comparison with today, and satellites now play an indispensable role in what we see every day in terms of weather forecasting. And in terms of looking forward to how the climate is going to behave in the future, it is likely that satellites will perform a similar indispensable role. So that's the innovation and growth strategy, what it's setting out to do, and one strand of the applications it sets out to develop is what are known as climate services. Now, as far as the IGS itself is concerned, what's the progress? Well, the space economy had an aggregate turnover of approaching 12 billion in 2012-13, and a compound annual growth rate of 8.6% since 2008-2009. Now, that's significantly ahead of the UK economy average, and is one of the reasons why space is now a high priority for the government in terms of rebalancing the economy and making sure that we have a more balance between financial services and other high value added activity in the economy. The acid test, of course, is looking at the growth in turnover and whether it's following a path which would result in 40 billion, i.e. a 10% share by 2030. And so far, we're on track, thank God. So, since we started the Innovation Growth Strategy, what's happened? We've created the UK Space Agency. Now, many of you may remember, before we had the UK Space Agency, we had a partnership called the British National Space Centre, which aggregated interest in space from many different government departments. That was proving quite difficult to go to the ESA ministerial and to negotiate a good position for the UK in the ESA programmes. The UK Space Agency was brought together. I think it was Lord Drayson, as the Science Minister at the time, insisted that we must have a better means of bringing together the UK's interest in space for his negotiations with ESA. So out of the IGS came the UK Space Agency. Also, the Space Satellite Applications Catapult. Space was not on the priority list for the Technology Strategy Board as it was at that time for a catapult. And indeed, therefore, we pushed that there should be a catapult in our sector. And the key here was to change it from space to satellite applications, largely because if you say space, what comes into your mind? Men in spacesuits going to Mars? Satellite applications has a different set of connotations and brings to mind a different set of associations. So it became the Satellite Applications Catapult, and it focuses on the downstream applications, largely, not wholly, but largely. We have the Space Leadership Council, which you may hear about from time to time, which David Willits introduced as a forum for the space community to talk directly to the Science Minister. And we still have that, we do still have a Space Leadership Council with the new set of ministers, and Joe Johnson meets with that twice a year. And we've created the Satellite Finance Network. Now, building out the downstream applications is going to require innovation, it's going to require new companies, they need to be financed. So the Satellite Finance Network is there to introduce people with money, from high net worth individuals and business angels to banks, to entrepreneurs who are setting out to build new companies to use the capability of the satellite network. So we've created those 4 new bodies, and we've achieved the step change in the UK contributions to ESA, and that's resulted in the ESA centre being created at Harwell, EXAT. We've increased the inward investment to the UK into the space sector. So I was hearing the other day of a company which is located from North America into the UK, and it said the UK is unique in having alignment between the government and its industry in terms of focusing on a common objective into the future. And they saw that as a major incentive for them to come and locate in the UK. And increased momentum to capitalise on these new market opportunities. So there have been some outcomes to date. We need to keep feeding these success stories and positive outcomes back to maintain confidence of government in investing in, or continuing to invest in the innovation and growth strategy. So there was a report produced back in 2013, Leadership in Climate Technologies and Services, and it developed 2 key recommendations: that the UK should act quickly to develop operational climate-related information services, and it says using satellite and other observations. So there will need to be terrestrial in situ, as they are known, observations combined with satellite data in order to construct a climate information service. And this is one of the challenges that we need to address in going forward. That is the combination of satellite data with other sources of data to build out an information service for end users.
Is that for the UK, climate data for the UK, or global climate data?
Global. In other words, if I take that 400 billion global market and we want 10% of it, then we need to be addressing global opportunities. So yes, this needs to be a supply chain and a system that operates globally. Otherwise, we are just not going to deliver our component of that for a 40 billion target that we have. The other realization was that we don't actually have a supply chain between the people producing satellite data and end users who actually just want the climate information service, largely without being too concerned about where the data came from, as long as they can rely on the information service. So those were the 2 key recommendations. And that second recommendation gave rise to the Climate Data from Space Stakeholders Group, the CDSSG, which is what's brought us here today. A group of largely public sector stakeholders got together and decided to tackle that second recommendation. How do we start to put together a seamless supply chain? And all credit to the people who were involved in those early days. Now, the UK has always been ahead in these things, and the Europeans followed us on that occasion. The EU has produced a European Research and Innovation Roadmap for climate services. This was a UK-led roadmap, and they have followed the UK's lead. The European Commission, I think, has recognised that they need better foresight of the impact of climate change within Europe, and they don't feel that up to now they have had a system in place which will give them the decision support that they need. So the European Commission is a customer for climate services. It has a need. It needs better information to support its planning and decision making. Therefore, it's a customer. But it's recognised that the supply chain that it needs to support it is not in place, and therefore it has established a roadmap to bring that supply chain into being. Now, park that thought for a minute, because I'm just going to go back and talk a bit more about the market. So that 2013 report that we produced, oh, sorry, no, don't park that thought just yet. I've extracted this definition from that European roadmap. If you read the words there, it actually says a climate service can be almost anything you want it to be. In other words, anything that starts with data at one end and ends up with the information you might need about climate at the other end. So it includes information and knowledge that support your adaptation strategy, mitigation management, disaster risk management, and anything else that changes in the climate may cause. So it's a very broad definition of climate services, and I think we would still find that if you go and talk to all sorts of different people about climate services, they'll give you very different definitions. I have to say also, and I'll come back to this later on, that trying to define what we mean by a climate service and using the right terminology is another challenge. If I go and talk to a water utility company and talk to them about climate services, they don't know what I'm talking about. They do know about water usage, how they plan storage and transmission in the future, but they have their own terminology, and one of the challenges is how we translate what we're doing here into the terminology of the end user. And climate services at the moment doesn't feature in their current terminology. And here are two more quotes from that EU report, which emphasise the potential for developing climate services and the impact they'll have if we get it right. So the European Commission it took them a little while. They had to go through a process of aligning all their directorates to have a common interest in climate, and there was a few arguments about which DG was actually going to be the owner of climate activity. But having gone through that process, I think it's come out now with a fairly coherent plan. So the EU is now putting money into this and into Copernicus, and a lot of that is being funded through the European Space Agency. So the EU puts money into the European Space Agency, which contracts for a variety of activities which have to be contracted on EU rules, i.e. no geo-return, and that brings us back to this uncertainty in the policy landscape. So, having parked the European roadmap for a moment, let me go back to the 2013 report, because we wanted to establish that there was a potential commercial market, and therefore a study was commissioned from a company called Knowledge Matrix, K-Matrix, and they did a monster data mining activity to try to ascertain the scale of the market. And what they have a massive database of commercial transactions, and what they did was to mine that database and look for commercial transactions where climate or climate services was a constituent component of something that changed hands between two trading partners. And they came up with a global figure for the climate market of 12.3 billion. That was in 2010-11. And by going back a few years and looking at projections, they were able to estimate the growth rate for those markets. And as you'll see, that's around 8 point something percent. So significant growth potential. They were also able to sectorize, no, that's a horrible word, isn't it? They were also able to divide up this market, these figures, into different application sectors. So you'll see that civil engineering comes out top. Now you can imagine here that civil engineers who are putting in major infrastructure installations, might be power stations or new railway lines, you do need to know in 40 years' time whether you're putting your asset into a locality which might be subject to the impact of climate change, i.e. you don't want to put it into places which are likely to flood in 40 years' time as a result of sea level rise or other climate-induced effects. So the top 8 were civil engineering, wind energy, local government, agriculture, oil and gas, water, media and broadcasting, and insurance and reinsurance. They were also able to look at in a bit more detail about why this climate information was needed. Now this is all a bit difficult to read, so don't screw your eyes up and try and read it. We will supply copies of this, and it's available in the original report if you want more detail. But the main thing is that the bulk of the users are requiring this information for planning and for decision support. So that's their need. Some of them are also interested in future asset values. So the insurance and the futures markets, for example, are interested in the potential impact of climate change on the value of assets that they're investing in now. So if you're going to go invest in a rainforest, you want to know that it's still going to be a rainforest in 40 years and hasn't turned into something else. Yes?
This K-matrix report, is that publicly available or?
We have certain, K-matrix don't want the whole report made publicly available, but there is a summary. And if you talk nicely to K-matrix, they will probably,
Okay, so that goes right into that.
I think, yes, they produced a massive database of results, and they do have a tool which allows you to re-slice the data in multiple different ways. It's an interesting exercise in doing this projection.
On the EU website?
No, afraid not. There is a summary which is publicly available. And certainly in the 2013 report, we quote a number of figures. All these figures are quoted from the 2013 report, and they are available to be republished. Okay. So yes, the impact on the value of future of assets in the future is another important. Those are the two main things that this information is being used for. So if I look at the drivers, what's driving this market? So if I am going to be investing in building a new company to deliver climate services, I need to know what's driving the market. I think we've established there that in theory there is a potential market. And by the way, I should say those market figures are for climate services regardless of where the data comes from. Okay, it's not just from satellite data. It is regardless of where the data comes from. And the two drivers here are adaptation planning. So we did go through a stage where most of the focus was on measures to mitigate climate change before it happens. The emphasis has shifted somewhat over time. People are now recognizing that it's going to happen, and the main priority is planning adaptation to the changes that are coming. And the second major driver is asset valuation. Investors wanting to know whether their investments are going to be at risk in future. The European Commission is a major driver, and we have this new initiative and roadmap. They are now not just a supporter of R&D, they are actually a large future customer. Their intent is to build up a market for climate services and a capability to supply within Europe, and then to export that globally. In the UK government circles, DEFRA has a new Earth observation roadmap, and DEC is responsible for measures to manage response and mitigation. Those two government departments have, I think, developed their perception of how they can use satellite data significantly in the last couple of years. As part of the IGS, there has been a strand called Space for Smarter Government, and that is helping government departments see how satellite data can be used in order to help them deliver their policy objectives more effectively. Yes?
Just one small point. The lead across government for domestic UK adaptation to climate change sits with DEFRA.
Yes. But they're yes, that's correct, but their aspects of what they're responsible for are different. And there is now the cross-government Earth observation working group. So all credit here. I think we have argued that joined-up government would be more effective, and that's is being done. So we have government departments getting together and exchanging best practice and knowledge on how to use assets like satellite data, which is very good to see.
Which is the
Yes.
DEFRA's EO roadmap openly available?
I've lost sight of where that is in the. It was going to be last summer. We have been through a few changes in the policy landscape since. Things that might be released publicly tend to get held back until changes. Anyway, I'm not sure it has been released publicly. We were expecting it to be released last summer.
If it was the report released in December 2015.
Sorry?
If it was the report released in December 2015, it is public. Is that
Yes, there is a public document, I think. Okay. And the need for better data and integrated information systems to support long-term planning is the driver. So as everybody becomes aware of the impact of potential climate change, that is another driver for the market. This is I'll say a little bit more now about how the EU is approaching that. This is their diagram which talks about the supply chain. So over here you've got a user community, and over here you've got satellite data being produced. In between the end user and this component here, you have consultancy services. This is what Chris was saying. You can't just feed data directly to the end users, because the end users are really not in a position to know how to interpret that data. It needs some interpretation and adaptation to specific end user needs, which is what consultancy services are seen to be needed for. Now, historically, we've got to this point because scientists have put satellites up into orbit which are capable of making measurements which are relevant to climate. And up until very recently, if you like, we were trying to take assets which were put in orbit for scientific research purposes and then use them to use the data that they produce in operational circumstances. Now, the Commission's view is that that's, with hindsight, the wrong way round. What we should be doing is talking to the end users, finding out what their requirements are, and then to put up an operational system, you work backwards from the requirement, work out what the delivery capability required is, and then build it and put it in place. So they are effectively trying to take this supply chain and turn it through 180 degrees. So it's driven by user requirements rather than by science and technology and what we think we could do if we put clever satellites up there. So a significant part of what they're trying to do is to turn the supply chain round. I have a slight beef with calling all of this climate services. We've struggled within the CDSSG to come up with the best representation of the supply chain. Here's another one which is closely parallels how the Met Office view climate weather services. So over here we have observations, data, modelling, and all the predictions of future climate impact. And that, I think everybody would agree, you would include that as climate services. Now, what comes out of this box here may go to specialist analytics companies, who then take all of that data and crunch it out and derive more conclusions from the data. And they are specialists in data analytics. They may then need to go to a consultancy, which would be the interface between the sort of thing they do and an end user, maybe a water utility. So these guys here will know the end user market and be able to interface between this box here and the end user. But not every organisation is at the same level of understanding and ability to process the data. So there will be consultancies who are capable of taking the results straight from the climate services box and then doing what they need to do with it and feeding it onto the end user clients. There will be some end user clients who are also sufficiently up to speed that they can take the data directly themselves. So in the insurance industry, Willis, for example, Willis Re, is been working on satellite data for a long time. They are well able to take raw data and interpret it for their own purposes. So we can also look at the supply chain in this way. Now, I personally find this fairly helpful because I think in terms of where you sit in the supply chain, it's useful to be able to decide which of these boxes you are and then adjust your business model accordingly. But you will find, I think, in the reports all sorts of different representations of the supply chain. What I would say is we need all the components there, because if there's a gap in the supply chain, you won't actually then get the end delivery to the end users. That's why developing the supply chain is so important. So, what are the barriers that we have to overcome? Well, if I go back to this diagram, a lot of these organisations don't know about each other and don't necessarily talk to each other, and we have a narrative problem in they all use different terminology. So actually getting this to flow properly is hampered at the moment by the fact that the organisations that make up this map are pretty fragmented and don't know about each other. So the fragmented community, the closest we've got to a climate services community is the CDSSG. So within the CDSSG meetings, there is a coming together of government, academia, and various components of industry. And one of the CDSSG's main purposes is to join up this supply chain. There's the difficulty of building service using assets that weren't designed for the purpose. Those of you who've been around in the space business for a while probably will remember Copernicus's predecessor, which was GMES, which was global monitoring of the environment for space. And the plan then was to try to join up disparate assets that were already in place to get them to do a useful job. Now, the EU roadmap is, as I've said, is trying to turn that round and drive from end users backwards, and that's the way that Copernicus is beginning to operate. But we are not there yet. So one of the first jobs that Copernicus is doing is trying to get more of a handle on end user requirements from the different end user sectors in order to be able to put this right so that we have an operational system which is designed for purpose and fit for purpose.
How far down the chain are they with that?
Sorry?
How far down the chain are they with that?
They've been letting contracts to do these user requirement studies, and the UK has been, thanks to the CDSSG's activity, I would say, very successful in winning those contracts. I'll come back to that in a minute. The other is the difficulty of assembling data needed for a specific application, which again Chris referred to. So there's a lot of data out there, but unless you are a scientist, probably who's been involved in preparing that data set, it's very hard for an end user to come in and find out where that data set is, what format it's in, and how you can pick it up and use it. There is another underlying issue here, which is who owns the data. So Copernicus is looking at making the data available free of charge to our community. But there is other data in there that we may need, which is got other intellectual property rights attached to it. So I have heard in the past that by the time the lawyers have sorted out who owns the data and who can do what with it, everybody's lost interest and moved on. It's important that that data policy is sorted out so that there isn't a complication of trying to sort out ownership before you go in and try and use it. Yes?
How can someone exert their IPR over data that's come from a publicly funded endeavour? I can't understand how a private company can say, we own this.
No, sorry, what I'm saying is that there is data out there produced by private companies. It's not all publicly owned. It's not all publicly
Everything
owned.
coming from Copernicus is free.
But the Copernicus stuff, yes, free access to the data from the Copernicus generated data is what is being implemented. So if it came from Copernicus, everybody should be free to use it. So I think we may hear a bit more. We've got a couple of case studies coming up, I think, about access to data. So people who are in that sort of analytics box would be saying, unless it's quick and easy for me to go and get the data and use it, it's going to be too expensive to include in anything I'm doing in terms of generating a commercial service. So we have to make that access quick and easy, and that's quite a significant challenge. And the third one here is the difficulty of assessing the value add from using satellite data. So people are delivering climate, what we might call climate services, based upon terrestrial data, in situ data, and anything else they can easily lay their hands on. What's the value of adding satellite data into this? And we don't have an answer to that at the moment. So ideally, you'd answer this question if you were trying to work out how much more investment you would put into creating this seamless supply chain. So there was then a report that came out this year, which has come up with 3 further recommendations, the first of which is to grow information exchange activities. So this is tackling the fragmented community problem. How do we bring together the people who may need to get together in order to work together to get the seamless supply chain? And that is something the IEA and the CDSSG are doing. So this is growing the information exchange activities, and this is being supported by the UK Space Agency, and hence this amongst other activities. Also, that report was looking at opportunities for the UK, and whilst the European Union is developing its own market and its own supply capability, the report said the UK, maybe this was fortuitous foresight, but we said somebody needs to be tackling the rest of the world and exporting services to the non-EU rest of the world. That should be the UK. Let's start looking at market opportunities in more detail beyond the European Union. So that was a second recommendation, which I think chimes quite well with certain policy lines which are being promoted at the moment. And the third is to develop UK data portals with application support to facilitate access to data, and there's activity going on here. I should say the CDSSG over this period has also done other work on supply chain and user requirements, and there are some reports available which may be helpful to you. So, yes.
So does that mean that the EU is developing portals?
Yes.
And also the UK will be
the UK is
doing something similar and in parallel?
the EU is developing portals. There is debate about whether those portals are what we would want if we were doing it ourselves on our own to suit UK purposes and UK suppliers. So at the moment, we are aware, we're looking at the EU developing their portals, but there is likely to be a UK interface, at least a UK interface, which will then customise what we can get out of those EU portals, assuming we can still get stuff out of those EU portals, which will actually customise and adapt it for our own purposes.
Right, so if we as users didn't find what we wanted through Copernicus, there might in the future be
Yes.
a sort of second layer, is it?
Yes. That's my perception of what the
But nothing
land.
exists at the moment, only is sort of constructed.
Nothing exists at an operational level. We're still at the let's put it together and see how it works and the sort of beta trials. Well, no, back one stage, the alpha trial stage. So that's part, I think, of what you're going to see later on. So where we've got to on that. So that's the report that came out earlier this year, and the UK Space Agency continues to support these activities with support to the IEA and the CDSSG. We'll put together this, I showed you some outcomes earlier on from the IGS as a whole, but looking at the outcomes from the climate services activity. So there's a timeline here. So in 2011, we initiated that high-level market sizing activity from Knowledge Matrix, which was jointly funded by industry and the UK Space Agency. That produced the report in 2013, so we sized the market and the aims were established. And that coordinated inputs and recommendations from multiple stakeholders. And although it was industry that led the production of that report, we had inputs from government departments, various different components of the industry, academia, and the Space Agency. 2014, the CDSSG was established to work on the seamless supply chain recommendation, funded and led by the Space Agency.
If we're talking about climate data as sort of handling data greater than sort of 10 years type thing, where does the sort of short-term data sit into all this?
In terms of...
Well, if we want to sort of feed for weather predictions, short-term weather predictions.
Yeah, there are two time spans here. If you're doing predictions, so you need long time span, consistent data sets in order to validate your models. But there is, in my mind anyway, there are also the short-term immediate needs, i.e. what's happened to this area of territory, and can we see how the climate is changing on a day-by-day, or what it's doing today. And I think that's open for anybody who spots an opportunity to go and build a service that a user wants based on that short-term need. I think that the long-term data sets have multiple uses. There are certain uses where you definitely need the time span and the consistency. In other areas, you may not need that level of rigor, and it may well be that you can convey to your end user useful information on a shorter time basis, but you probably need to go and trawl what's available in the big databases to find it.
But does that still get covered by the climate data groups when we start talking about climate being
Yes.
long-term?
My view is that it covers both of those. But there is a community who is very interested in the climate quality data sets, by which they mean long time period, low uncertainty, highly consistent data sets. And there's another component of the community which is less interested in that. But certainly when we put the report together, there was a degree of debate between the academic community that was interested in the climate quality and prioritising that, because that's where the research need was foreseen, and the more pragmatic, shorter term, can I use some of this data and go out and build a business quickly on it, community. So I think that's still open for exploration. But I count them all as climate services. So if I go back to the Knowledge Matrix report, anything where information changes hands between two parties and one of them's paying the other, and a component of that is climate-related information, is what I would classify as a climate service. And then in 2015, UK secures leading roles in the EU Climate Services Initiative. We'll see how that works out in the light of recent policy or recent decisions. The CDSSG has been very effective in coordinating the UK inputs to the Space Agency for ESA's climate change initiative, and also for the ministerial coming up. So to put coordinated views into ESA programs, the CDSSG is a very useful body because it brings together academic and industrial and other interests to help the agency with prioritisation. And then NERC last December allocated 120,000 to 6 proof of concept projects, which are proof of concept application projects. So this is NERC supporting the activities in this area. This year, we know that the network has helped the UK to win and lead 4 of the 7. Now, I should say what the ECMWF is. The ECMWF is the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasting. It has been given the responsibility of implementing a lot of the procurements to look at end user needs, etc., by the EU. So they have mandated and funded the ECMWF to act as a centre for bringing the delivery of the roadmap together in many respects. They have been letting contracts for sectoral information system studies, and the UK has won 4 of the 7 that have been let in water, energy, agriculture and insurance, valued together at €4.7 million. And the plan was to put the UK in a good position to bid for and win more of these contracts as we go through the implementation of the roadmap, which is why, how shall we say, negotiating the UK's involvement in future European programmes is quite significant to us. So then there was this further report published, the second report that I mentioned, with those 3 other recommendations to expand the knowledge exchange, etc. The Space Agency and the National Centre for Earth Observation have allocated 500,000 for a UK Climate Data from Space Computing Zone, I think is the correct terminology, which is, again, looking at tools and techniques for accessing data sets. So that's what you're going to be looking at later on in the workshop. And the CDSSG has become focal point for Climate Working Group update of essential climate variables inventory. The essential climate variables, if you're not aware, there are about 50 of them, if I remember correctly. 50 variables that you could measure in order to ascertain what's happening with the climate. A number of those are already being measured from satellites. Some are not yet being measured, and the future development of the ESA Climate Change Initiative is looking at which variables which are not currently being measured would be useful and helpful to measure into the future. And the CDSSG is a good focal point for that. And then there are some concurrent developments, as I already alluded to. The EC, going on in parallel with all that the UK has been doing, is the EC roadmap, the ECMWF's role in delivering the roadmap, and the UK's cross-government working group on Earth observation. So all of those are positive developments which have come out in the course of taking climate services through the IGS process. And I think, oops, excuse me, I'll have to, right, other acronyms which you may come across. ECMWF we've already talked about, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, Committee on Earth Observation Satellites, CEOS, and GEOS, Global Earth Observation System of Systems. These are all international collaborative bodies which the UK is to a greater or lesser extent involved in, and part of the strategy here is to make sure the UK's voice is heard in all of these bodies so that the UK's interests are, as far as possible, fed into future international activity. That, I think, concludes it.